The stillness of the midnight office was shattered by an unexpected sound, a low murmur of voices coming from the conference room. Ellie Reed, the young janitor who had spent countless nights scrubbing floors and emptying trash bins, froze mid-step. The building was supposed to be empty, save for her. The faint light slipping through the crack beneath the door only heightened her unease. Slowly she moved closer, her breath catching as the conversation grew clearer. "The money transfers tomorrow. We can't afford any loose ends," said a voice, smooth but laced with menace. Another replied, "Consider it done." Ellie's heart thundered in her chest as the weight of their words sank in. She should have turned and walked away, but her feet stayed rooted, a mix of fear and curiosity holding her captive. She was in the wrong place, at the worst possible time. Before we dive into this thrilling story, tell us, would you risk everything to expose the truth? Like and subscribe to hear how it unfolds. Ellie Reed had never imagined her life would look like this, scrubbing floors under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights while the rest of the world slept. At just 21, she carried more weight on her shoulders than most. After losing her parents in a car accident 5 years ago, Ellie had become the sole provider for her younger brother, Leo. Every shift she worked in the towering high-risers was another step toward keeping food on the table and a roof over their heads. The office building was her nightly domain, its sprawling glass-walled corridors a stark contrast to the cramped, run-down apartment she called home. Most nights the solitude felt almost comforting, offering a brief reprieve from the noise of her daily struggles. But tonight, as Ellie moved between the empty cubicles, her usual calm was replaced by a prickling sense of unease. The polished floors gleamed under her meticulous care, but Ellie's eyes kept darting to the shadows. She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't as alone as she should be. Her brother's voice echoed in her mind, teasing her about her overactive imagination, but Ellie had learned to trust her instincts. They had been her guide through years of hardship, and they rarely steered her wrong. Her routine was simple: clean the offices floor by floor, avoid the corners where the flickering lights made everything look haunted, and always leave the top floor for last. The top floor belonged to the executives, a world of leather chairs and polished mahogany that felt a million miles away from hers. Ellie had never given much thought to the lives of the people who worked here. To her, they were just names on door plaques, reminders of an unattainable world. But tonight, that world was about to collide with hers in a way she could never have predicted. As she neared the executive floor, a sound caught her attention, a muffled thud followed by hushed voices. Her grip tightened on her cleaning cart, and her heart raced. This wasn't normal. Taking a steadying breath, Ellie crept toward the source, the faint glimmer of light spilling from the conference room pulling her closer. Ellie pressed herself against the wall just outside the conference room, her breath shallow and her heart pounding like a drum. The voices were clearer now, every word carrying a sinister undertone. "This has to be airtight," said a man with a sharp, authoritative tone. "If anyone gets wind of this, we're finished." Another voice, softer but no less chilling, replied, "The transfers are already in motion. By the time anyone notices, we'll be untouchable. But there's still the matter of those who know too much." Ellie's stomach churned. She wasn't sure what they were talking about, but the cold calculation in their voices left no doubt. It wasn't something she was supposed to hear. She knew she should walk away, pretend she hadn't heard anything, but curiosity rooted her to the spot. Carefully, she peeked through the narrow gap in the door. Two figures stood inside, a man in an expensive suit and a woman with a clipboard, her sharp eyes scanning a stack of papers. The tension between them was palpable, their words laced with secrecy and danger. Ellie shifted her weight, and the cleaning supplies in her cart rattled. The noise was slight, but it felt deafening in the quiet corridor. Both heads snapped toward the door, and Ellie ducked out of sight, her pulse racing. "Did you hear that?" the man asked, his voice low and suspicious. The woman moved toward the door, her heels clicking ominously against the floor. Ellie's fingers tightened around the handle of her cart as she backed away, her mind racing. She turned and hurried down the hall, forcing herself to keep her pace steady despite the panic rising in her chest. The elevator felt 1,000 miles away. Behind her, she heard the door creak open, and the woman's voice call out, "Who's there?" Ellie didn't look back. She couldn't. Back in the janitor's closet, Ellie slammed the door shut, her chest heaving as she tried to collect herself. What had she stumbled into? The words transfers and loose ends echoed in her mind, each syllable tinged with menace. She wanted to believe it was none of her business, but deep down, she knew the truth. She had heard something dangerous, something that could put her in serious trouble. As she sat on the edge of an overturned bucket, her eyes landed on a crumpled piece of paper sticking out of her apron pocket. She must have picked it up earlier without thinking. Unfolding it, she found what looked like a spreadsheet, numbers and accounts scrawled across it in neat rows. It didn't make much sense to her, but the logo at the top of the page was unmistakable, the company's. Her hands trembled as she realized this might be connected to what she'd overheard. Suddenly, a knock sounded on the janitor's closet door, sharp and deliberate. Ellie froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Maintenance?" called a deep voice from the other side. "We need to check something in here." She stood paralyzed, the paper crumpled in her fist. The voice wasn't familiar. Whoever it was, they weren't from her team. No. The knock came again, harder this time. "Open up," the voice demanded. Ellie's mind raced, weighing her options. If she stayed, they'd find her, and the paper. If she ran, she might draw more attention. Slowly, she slid the paper into her sock, pulling her pant leg over it. She grabbed a mop and opened the door, forcing a nervous smile. A man in a dark suit stood before her, his eyes sharp and assessing. "Did you hear anything unusual tonight?" he asked, his tone casual but his gaze unyielding. Ellie shook her head, gripping the mop tightly. "No, sir. Just the usual quiet." The man's eyes lingered on her for a moment longer before he stepped back. "If you see or hear anything strange, you let us know immediately," he said, his words carrying an unspoken threat. Ellie nodded, her heart pounding as he walked away. That night, back in her tiny apartment, Ellie stared at the spreadsheet, her mind replaying the conversation she had overheard. Her instinct screamed at her to let it go, but a nagging voice in the back of her mind wouldn't let her rest. She wasn't sure what she had stumbled into, but one thing was clear. It was far bigger than her. The weight of what Ellie had discovered pressed heavily on her chest as she sat in the dimly lit kitchen of her apartment. The spreadsheet lay before her on the table, its cryptic numbers and account details taunting her with their incomprehensibility. Her younger brother Leo was asleep in the next room, his soft snores a fragile reminder of everything Ellie was trying to protect. She knew she should throw the paper away, pretend she'd never seen or heard anything, but she couldn't shake the feeling that walking away would make her complicit in whatever terrible scheme was unfolding. The next day, Ellie left for work earlier than usual. She needed answers. At the library, she accessed a public computer and began searching the company name alongside keywords like fraud, embezzlement, and scandal. Buried deep in the search results, she found an article from 3 years ago. It detailed allegations against one of the company's top executives, a man named Julian Cartwright, for funneling funds through shell companies. The case had been dismissed due to a lack of evidence, but the article hinted at a whistleblower who had mysteriously disappeared before the trial. Ellie's stomach churned. She remembered the voices she'd overheard, the cold precision in their words. Loose ends. Could they have been talking about that whistleblower? Her hands trembled as she printed the article and tucked it into her bag. She didn't know what her next step should be, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her life was already entangled in this conspiracy. That evening, she reached out to the only person she thought might help. Sam Torres, an investigative journalist whose name was on the byline of the article she had found. Using a payphone near the library, Ellie dialed the number listed on Torres's website, her heart pounding with every ring. When he answered, his voice was brisk and slightly irritated. "Torres here. Who is this?" Ellie hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. I work at Riverway Corporation. I overheard something, and I think it's connected to an old story you wrote about Julian Cartwright." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Torres replied, his tone sharper now. "What exactly did you overhear?" Ellie quickly summarized the conversation she'd heard and mentioned the spreadsheet she had found. Torres's silence was unnerving. "Meet me tomorrow," he finally said, "at the diner on 5th and Main, noon, and bring that spreadsheet." Before Ellie could respond, he hung up. The next day, Ellie walked into the diner, clutching her bag like a lifeline. Torres was easy to spot. A scruffy man in his late 30s, hunched over a cup of coffee with a notebook open on the table. He looked up as she approached, his sharp eyes scanning her face. "Ellie?" he asked, and she nodded, sliding into the seat across from him. She handed him the spreadsheet and the article she'd printed. Torres studied the paper with an intensity that made Ellie's palms sweat. Finally, he looked up. "This is big," he said, his voice low. "If this is what I think it is, you've stumbled onto a massive fraud operation. These accounts look like they're tied to offshore shell companies, and if they're talking about loose ends, that means people are in real danger." Ellie swallowed hard. "What do we do?" Torres leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "We need more evidence. This spreadsheet isn't enough to take them down, it's just a fragment. But if we can get access to their internal server, we might find the rest of the puzzle." Ellie's heart sank. "You mean, I have to go back in there?" Torres gave her a grim look. "If you're willing. It's risky, but without someone on the inside, we don't stand a chance." That night, Ellie barely slept. She kept thinking about Leo, about how much he depended on her. If anything happened to her, what would happen to him? But she also thought about the whistleblower who had vanished, about the people who might lose everything if this conspiracy went unchecked. By morning, her mind was made up. She would help Torres. The following evening, Ellie walked into work with a new sense of purpose. She avoided the conference room and its occupants, instead focusing on her plan. The server room was located on the executive floor, locked behind a coded door. She'd overheard the code once when an IT technician had unlocked it in her presence. She hoped it hadn't been changed. As the building emptied for the night, Ellie made her move. Her cleaning cart provided perfect cover as she wheeled it into the hallway near the server room. Her heart pounded as she punched in the code. The green light blinked, and the door clicked open. She slipped inside, the cool hum of servers surrounding her. Doris had given her a USB drive to plug into one of the main terminals. It was designed to copy files without leaving a trace. Ellie located the terminal and inserted the drive, her fingers trembling as she navigated the system. Minutes felt like hours as the progress bar inched forward. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Her paranoia was justified. Just as the transfer completed, the door swung open and a tall figure loomed in the doorway. It was Ms. Vaughn, her clipboard replaced with a cold, calculating expression. "Well, well," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Looks like we have a little spy." Ellie's blood ran cold. She grabbed the USB drive and backed away, but Vaughn stepped inside, blocking the exit. "Do you have any idea what you've gotten yourself into?" Vaughn sneered. "You're in over your head, sweetheart." Before Ellie could respond, another figure entered the room. Julian Cartwright himself. His presence was commanding, his dark suit immaculate despite the late hour. He glanced at the USB drive in Ellie's hand and smiled, a chilling expression devoid of warmth. "Hand it over," he ordered. Ellie clutched the drive tighter, her mind racing. She spotted a fire alarm on the wall to her left. Without thinking, she lunged toward it and pulled it down. The alarm blared, deafening and disorienting. Vaughn shouted something, but Ellie didn't stay to listen. She darted past them and into the hallway, her sneakers squeaking against the polished floors. The building was a maze of chaos as employees evacuated, their faces a blur as Ellie weaved through the crowd. She could hear Vaughn and Cartwright shouting behind her, but she didn't look back. She sprinted to the nearest stairwell and descended as fast as her legs would carry her. Bursting into the cool night air, Ellie kept running until she reached the diner where she had met Torres. She handed him the USB drive, her breath coming in ragged gasps. This has everything," she managed to say. Torres nodded, his expression a mix of relief and admiration. "You've done more than enough," he said. "I'll take it from here." The next morning, Ellie awoke to a new level of unease. Torres had promised to review the files and take them to a trusted contact, but Ellie couldn't shake the sense that she was still in danger. Her instincts were confirmed when, walking Leo to school, she noticed a black sedan idling at the corner of their street. The same car appeared again outside her building later that evening, its windows tinted too dark to see inside. Ellie's nerves frayed with every passing hour. She hadn't heard from Torres since handing over the USB drive, and her calls to him went unanswered. By nightfall, her anxiety had reached a breaking point. She double-checked the locks on her doors and windows and kept her phone within arm's reach. When a loud knock echoed through the apartment just after midnight, Ellie's stomach dropped. "Who is it?" she called, her voice shaky. "Maintenance," came the reply, the same deep voice she remembered from the janitor's closet at work. Her blood ran cold. She grabbed Leo from his bed and hurried him into the small crawl space beneath the kitchen counter. "Stay quiet," she whispered, her heart pounding as she shut the panel behind him. The knock came again, louder this time. Ellie's mind raced. She couldn't let them in, but she also couldn't let them force their way inside while Leo was here. Grabbing a heavy skillet from the stove, she positioned herself by the door. "Go away!" she shouted, trying to sound braver than she felt. The door burst open, splintering against the wall. Two men stormed in, their movements deliberate and menacing. Ellie swung the skillet at the first man, the heavy metal catching him in the shoulder. He grunted in pain but didn't go down. The second man lunged for her, grabbing her wrist and twisting it until the skillet clattered to the floor. "Where's the drive?" the first man snarled, his eyes blazing with fury. "I don't have it," Ellie gasped, struggling against their grip. "Wrong answer," he growled, dragging her to the center of the room. The other man began tearing through her belongings, overturning furniture and ripping open drawers. The chaos was deafening, but Ellie's thoughts remained on Leo, hidden just a few feet away. Leo. Before they could press her further, a loud knock sounded at the door. The men froze, exchanging wary glances. "Police! Open up!" a voice barked. The intruders scrambled for the back exit, disappearing into the night just as the door burst open again, this time revealing Torres and a uniformed officer. Ellie collapsed to the floor, her body trembling with relief and exhaustion. "You're safe now," Torres said, helping her to her feet. "I got your message and brought backup. Are you okay?" Ellie nodded weakly, pulling Leo from the crawl space. The officer radioed for additional units while Torres led Ellie to the couch. "We need to get you both somewhere safe," he said. Hours later, Ellie and Leo found themselves in a safe house on the outskirts of the city. The small, unassuming building felt like a fortress compared to their apartment. Torres explained that the files on the USB drive had confirmed widespread embezzlement and implicated several high-ranking executives, including Julian Cartwright and Ms. Vaughn. But the evidence was only part of the battle. "They'll do whatever it takes to protect themselves," Torres warned. "You've done enough, Ellie. Let me handle the rest." But Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The men who had broken into her home weren't just after the USB drive. They were after her. The next day, Torres arranged for a meeting with his contact at the district attorney's office. Ellie agreed to testify about what she'd overheard, knowing it was the only way to ensure justice. But as they traveled to the courthouse, a black SUV rammed their car, forcing them off the road. Ellie's head slammed against the window as the car skidded to a stop. Torres groaned beside her, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. The SUV's doors flew open and armed men spilled out, their faces obscured by masks. Ellie's hands barked, yanking the car door open. Ellie's hands trembled as she climbed out, her mind racing for a way to escape. Torres staggered to his feet, shielding Ellie with his body. "You don't want to do this," he said, his voice steady despite the blood dripping from his brow. "Shut up," one of the men snapped, raising his weapon. Ellie spotted a loose piece of asphalt by her feet and scooped it up. Without thinking, she hurled it at the man's face, buying Torres just enough time to tackle him. The others rushed forward, but the sound of approaching sirens made them hesitate. "They called the cops," one shouted. "Let's go." The men piled back into the SUV and sped off, leaving Ellie and Torres shaken but alive. Moments later, police arrived, and Torres handed over the USB drive and a full account of the attack. "They was too close," Torres said as they sat in the back of a patrol car. "You're done, Ellie. No more risks." But Ellie wasn't convinced. As long as Cartwright and his associates remained free, she and Leo would never truly be safe. That evening, Torres received a call from the DA's office. The files Ellie had retrieved were enough to secure warrants for Cartwright and Vaughn's arrest. By dawn, news of the scandal had broken, sending shockwaves through the corporate world. Cartwright was arrested at his estate, his polished facade crumbling as he was led away in handcuffs. Vaughn attempted to flee but was caught at the airport with a one-way ticket to a non-extradition country. Watching the news from the safe house, Ellie felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. She had done what she set out to do, but the cost had been high. Torres visited later that day, his expression lighter than she'd ever seen. "You're a hero, Ellie," he said. "Because of you, they're going to pay for what they've done." The broken lost his eyes as if lost in struggle. She turned to Scrooge's. The floor was covered with ribbons of string. Ellie shook her head. "I'm just glad it's over." But Torres smiled knowingly. "It's not just over, it's a beginning. People are going to remember what you did. You made a difference." For the first time in weeks, Ellie felt like she could breathe again. The safe house, though small and bare, was a sanctuary compared to the chaos she had just survived. Leo played quietly in the corner, unaware of the full scope of what his sister had endured. The news coverage of Julian Cartwright and Ms. Vaughn's arrests played on the television, filling the room with a sense of closure. Images of Cartwright being escorted in handcuffs and Vaughn's failed escape attempt were everywhere. Their crimes, embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy were now public knowledge, and Ellie's efforts were at the heart of the story. Torres had insisted she stay under protection for a few more days, even though the danger seemed to have passed. The district attorney's office had assured her that the case was strong, thanks to her testimony and the files she had risked her life to retrieve. She had done more than enough, they told her. She had no reason to feel guilty for wanting to move on. A knock at the door startled her, but it was only Torres. He walked in with a small, satisfied smile and a folder in his hand. "Thought you'd want to see this," he said, placing the folder on the table. Ellie hesitated before opening it, her breath catching as she scanned the contents. Inside were letters of thanks from the whistleblower advocacy group, a formal commendation from the district attorney, and a letter from a community scholarship foundation. "They were impressed," Torres said, nodding at the scholarship letter. "They want to help you get back on your feet, support you in pursuing whatever you want to do next." Ellie blinked, overwhelmed by the sudden wave of emotions. For years, her dreams of becoming a writer had felt like a distant fantasy, something she couldn't afford to chase while working 2 jobs and raising her brother. But now, the path seemed clear. "What about Leo?" she asked softly. "I can't just uproot him. It's like—" Torres chuckled. "They've thought of that too. The scholarship covers everything. Tuition, housing, even daycare for Leo if you need it. You've done more than enough for everyone else, Ellie. Maybe it's time to do something for yourself." The next morning, Ellie stood on the balcony of the safe house, watching the sun rise over the quiet neighborhood. For the first time in years, she felt hopeful. She thought about the whistleblower who had disappeared years ago, about the people who might have suffered if she hadn't acted. Her fear had been justified, but her courage had been stronger. The day Ellie and Leo left the safe house, Torres handed her a small package. Inside was a leather-bound notebook with her initials embossed on the cover. "For your stories," he said, "you've got plenty to tell." Months later, Ellie sat in a bright, sunlit apartment in a new city, Leo playing happily in the next room. Her laptop hummed softly as she typed the final lines of her first short story, one inspired by her journey. She smiled, reading over the last sentence. Courage, she realized, wasn't about being fearless. It was about standing up even when fear threatened to knock you down. The biggest problem she'd faced today was the relentless criticism she'd been getting. As she pressed save and leaned back in her chair, Ellie felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She thought about Torres, about the people who had supported her, and about the sacrifices she had made. The television played quietly in the background, another story of corruption and bravery unfolding in the headlines. Torres looked. Ellie didn't see herself as a hero, but she knew one thing for certain. Sometimes, the most ordinary people could make the biggest difference. Thank you for watching this story until the end. What would you have done if you were in Ellie's shoes? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this.